Hello and welcome to Indie Book Magic, a podcast that connects geek readers and writers in an open, lighthearted, and occasionally random environment. We're your friendly hosts, Janeen Ippolito and
H.L. Burke.
And Heidi, what are we tackling today?
We're tackling Destiny and Fate. I hope not football style, because that could get dangerous.
Well, we do mention Eagles later on, but yeah, I live in Philadelphia area-ish, so that Eagles and football kind of connect for me. But
yeah, I'm originally from Oregon. We don't even have a football team, so I'm like the Switzerland of the United States as far as the Super Bowl goes.
Oh goodness, I spent a lot of my childhood in various parts of Pennsylvania, and in those places, it's the Steelers, the Stillers, and the Eagles, and yeah, so football has kind of already saturated my life. But today we're not actually talking about that. As Heidi mentioned, we're talking about Destiny and Fate in stories. And when we're doing this, we are going to be using primarily movie examples, not book examples, when we're talking to your awesome writers and readers and listeners about how to use these in stories. And we are choosing to use movie examples for a couple of specific reasons, one of which is...
Mainly we like authors, Janeen, and we don't want to pick apart their work. With movies, it seems it's easier to, because you're not picking on one person. There's very rarely one single solitary vision behind any given movie. It's a studio project. So it's a little less mean, I think, to tell you what you thought it was wrong about a movie, as opposed to an author's vision, which is a lot of times their primary baby.
Yeah, another reason is, I'll be honest, plot twists for me, whether or not I'll accept them, has to do a lot with the writer's craft and my enjoyment of their overall story. If the plot is really unbelievable for me for whatever reason, I often don't finish the book. And since I haven't finished the book, I don't really feel like I can judge the whole thing because I didn't get through it. And a lot of times I'll have books that I did finish and I really enjoyed, and I knew there were plot twists, but I didn't really care because the characters were awesome and the world building was awesome and everything else was awesome. So having, an unbelievable twist didn't bother me as much. That's not saying you shouldn't work at doing nice airtight plots, but it does mean me speaking as a reader. I have my reader hat on, not my editor hat on. My clients know that I'm very much a stickler for plotting in terms of editing, but in terms of when I'm reading something, if an author has enough really strong craft in other areas, I often won't really even be aware of plot holes, or if I am aware of them, I will accept them or forgive them because I liked the characters, I liked the world, I liked the voice. And with movies, I find I'm much less forgiving than with books for some reason. Maybe it's because it is so primarily a visual medium. So there's not as many factors that can always affect things. Although I have heard people who have said, oh, that's a popcorn movie. You don't have to judge the plot. It doesn't matter if it's full of plot holes. It's a popcorn movie. So it goes both ways.
Yeah, I think movies are easier to find ones that people are familiar with. And if you want to talk about twists and stuff, it's better to use a movie that you don't, because you don't have that spoiler thing going on. Like, by now, if we're spoiling The Empire Strikes Back for you, that's your own dang fault. You should have seen it by now.
although, according to Heidi, I am not allowed to talk about The Last Jedi, which has about killed me because
it's been less than a year until it has had a DVD release. Once it has a DVD release, then you're free.
It's true, and so I will only just say this: there is documented proof that the new director and the director of the previous movie did not have very different visions. And so whatever else you want to say about it in terms of plotting and in terms of doing really random things to try to make things work, The Last Jedi kind of wins that category hands down. But how it should have ended for that one was brilliant. But moving on from that, we are going to be talking about one common theme as we're going about these different categories, and that is the need to set boundaries and rules. So we're not saying don't be random. We're not saying be super rigid or whatever. We're just saying have some kind of rules set in your story world, especially when you're talking about speculative fiction, where part of world building is setting the rules and boundaries for your story world. So, for example, Sanderson has his 3 rules of magic. And so when you're doing the world building in terms of magic, you know that probably some random things can happen because of that. One of the fun things about stories is having random impossible things happen in ways that surprise the characters, especially those really know-it-all characters who swear it can't happen that way. At the same time, he still has a couple of key principles that he ultimately follows so that readers feel secure in what's happening in the story. And so as we look through these different categories, that's the one thing that kept coming up for us, is that you do need to set some kind of rules and limits and guidelines for your story to just help readers latch onto something and understand if something makes sense or not.
Yeah, and a reader will accept a lot as long as it's part of what you've established. I mean, if a character suddenly flies in an average book, it's considered out of the norm. But if you're in Peter Pan, then that's been established as part of the canon. So I think that it's a major part of what works and doesn't work in your story is actually going to fall back on world building and what exists in that world. If the world follows regular physics, if this does have magic in it, stuff like that. You don't want big world building bombs to be dropped in the final act, really.
Yeah, agreed. And so that's where, when you are playing and figuring out your stories, speaking again as a former pantser here who now tends to put on some structure before I go into drafting, you do need to have some things figured out ahead of time, if at all possible, just for your own sanity. Otherwise, your editing and your revisions are going to be terrible as you're trying to make everything fit into some kind of order. Now, going on to those wonderful categories, one of the first sections we have is random story twists. When things just get flipped around for no reason, and we're not talking about a midpoint reversal. So if you're familiar with story structure at all, you have the inciting incident, you have the climax, you have the resolution, and somewhere in between the inciting incident and the climax is that midpoint reversal where your main character stops being a ping pong ball in a pinball machine, which that doesn't actually make sense. But the point is, they stop being buffeted around by circumstances. They stop clinging to whatever security blanket they have, and they start really moving forward. And whether or not you go for the 3-act structure entirely, midpoint reversals are really valuable for character arcs. We're not talking about that, because midpoint reversals, you would have had a character have an issue at the beginning and growing towards it. It doesn't come out of where it's not random. And we're talking about the random things that really have people acting out of character. And when we talk about random, again, I'm going to bring this up, you actually still need to have some kind of foreshadowing. It doesn't need to be like out the entire book, but you do need to have at least some sense that the character is in some way, shape, or form capable of the thing, even if they never have done it.
You don't want your twists to be so telegraphed that we're just waiting for them. But if they don't have any sort of foreshadowing, then I think then the reader feels cheated a little bit or blindsided. And those aren't really emotions you want in your reader. They want to feel like, oh yeah, of course, not what?
Yeah, and there's some leeway in this. It almost comes down to a point where if your main character suddenly starts throwing knives with great skill, and this is a character who had previously shown no interest in anything aggressive at all, nothing, not even the slightest twinge, that's going to be a little bit problematic for readers. We're not asking to see them doing it for fun or something, but we want to see something. Actually, the movie Hancock, if you've seen that one, has a great twist in it. And again, we're following the rules here that spoilers. There's this one female character who's made up to be very sweet and very nice, and then she throws a refrigerator at someone else because she has superpowers and didn't tell anyone else about it. But the thing is, even though that it feels like a random twist, at the same time, you can look back and say, oh, well, she was looking kind of funny here. And there was a little hint of something here. You can't exactly call it true giveaways, but as you look back, it feels random without feeling completely unearned.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's what we're going to go for here. It can be random, but give us a tiny bit of earning it in some way. Give us a sense that in some way it could be possible. And I mean, the one thing that kind of can break this rule is for comic effect. That's the one area that I can think of that completely you can ditch foreshadowing, is if it's for comedy. But those things you often find in short stories or skits or those kind of things where you don't generally have very strongly developed characters anyway. So a character acting out of character doesn't mean as much because everyone's characters are pretty shallow and it's there to make a point. So for comic effect, you can probably have something completely random happen. But even then, Heidi has a character she's going to bring up that was used for comic effect, but it got kind of old after a while.
It went off the rails, yes. And I don't know if people are going to be able to guess who I'm talking about. But yeah, and I think that let's say that the next thing we want to talk about is the sudden betrayal. And I've got both for movies, a good example of this and a bad example of this. And for the good example, I'm going to go with my favorite movie ever, The Empire Strikes Back, which is the perfect date night movie, the perfect family movie, the perfect everything movie. That's my favorite movie.
We had no idea, Heidi.
Yes. And this is spoiler territory. So if you have not watched this movie that is older than I am, and I am not young anymore, well,
then Heidi will judge you forever for not watching it.
You have been judged.
The poor will judge you.
Yes, but the point is Lando Calrissian in The Empire Strikes Back is, I think, a good example of betrayal because it very much suits his character. We're kind of, from the beginning, telegraphed that this character may not always be how he appears. I mean, he comes and he does that fake out with Han where we have a reason to believe that there might be some tension between them, and pretends he's going to attack him and instead hugs him. And so that character is a little bit off balance. Plus, we are led to understand his motives, that he's in it for like he's a rule breaker. He's kind of a random wild card. So when he does betray, it's not completely unmerited, but at the same time, he has been acting like he is their friend up in this point, and he's not acting really shifty in a way like you're telling the characters they're idiots for trusting this guy. You feel like they would trust this guy, but you understand why he would betray them. So he walks that delicate balance, and you understand his motives. You understand what he's getting at. Now, a badly done example of this is it the second or the third movie that this happens in? Can you remember? Because it has been years since I've seen the Pirates movies.
Yeah, one thing I actually wanted to add in for the previous with Lando Calrissian is that what makes it a little more satisfying for the audience is that you get both point of views as well. Because even while Hans is like, he's my friend, he has given me no reason not to trust him. You have Leia being like, I don't know. And so while you don't really know which side to believe, the audience can at least feel like both points were made. So the betrayal is satisfying without feeling like it's out of the blue, because there was someone coming in being skeptical about it.
Yeah.
In terms of the Pirates, I gotta be honest with you, I've kind of blocked out like Pirates 2 and Pirates 3 very much.
Partly because one of those two.
It's a lot. I felt I used a lot of random stuff happening, especially with the character of Jack Sparrow in those movies. So I did not pay very much attention to them.
Yeah, in one of those, it might actually be even in both, is there's like a point where he's on a different side for once every 5 minutes. And it's like every time there's a turn of fortune and it starts going better for one side, he bails ship and goes to that side. And maybe the first 2 times it's kind of funny that he did it. But on the third or fourth time, it's totally unbelievable, because why would the side accept you at that point? And it just feels like the character has no purpose, no goal, because he's just bang, 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 bouncing off every time the wind blows to another thing, which makes him completely useless from a story point, because he has no anchor. In the first movie, Jack Sparrow does betray people. He does do things that are unexpected, but it's all towards an end goal that he's working at behind the scenes. He's playing his own long game, and he does things that he think will further that long game. And when you cut the anchor cord on that character and he starts just being a balloon that's getting tossed around from the wind, he becomes A, completely useless, and B, really annoying really fast, at least to me.
Yeah, and I would say that's an area where, they were trying to combine a more or less serious action adventure thing with also a very popcorn flick aesthetic. And you, audience and listeners, can be the judge whether or not they did a good job with that. But it's always going to be problematic when you're trying to incorporate those things together, because they increasingly use Jack Sparrow's character as a buffoon, as someone to just be goofy for comedic effect. At the same time, they kept making the actual story world darker and darker and darker, and expected you to believe a lot of that in some way or another. And so you saw increasingly through the second and third movies, his character really stuck out in a really stark contrast with that. And whether or not you were able to accept that you have this really comedic, completely makes no sense character against this increasingly dark story, is up to your preference. It wasn't really in my preference after a while, but and that you can hear it clearly wasn't in Heidi's preference, but it might be yours, and that can be a thing. A movie that recently did this that people absolutely loved was actually Thor Ragnarok, which had comedy directly up next to very dark things, and it got rave reviews. So there is an audience for that, and that can be a thing. But again, if you want to do that angle, be prepared that you're probably going to get some mixed reviews in terms of people being willing to accept that very randomness versus a very, very dark story.
I think with Thor, one reason it works a little better though is the story actually calls Loki. His thing is he betrays people, but the story actually calls him out to the point where Thor, who is not the brightest tool, not the brightest tool in the shed, not the brightest bulb in the tool house. Whatever he is, he's not supposed to be this mastermind character, but he sees Loki's betrayal coming because it's like the fifth or fourth time. And I think that being able to say that the script itself calls out that, oh yeah, that character is going to betray you, kind of helps the readers feel like it's taking them a little more seriously. Or not readers, in this case, it would be the viewers.
Audience. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not like with Jack Sparrow's like, are we supposed to be surprised now? Because we're not. Because the movie isn't even surprised at Loki's betrayal. Mm-hmm. And it shouldn't be surprised about Captain Jack either.
That's true. They are setting a different tone for that movie, and the construction is very well towards that. And we could go back and forth about how well they execute that, because I have strong feelings about that movie. But moving on towards our thing, which is helping you writers get the tools you need to do well. The next thing is the cavalry arrives. So it's the last moment. You know, the clock is winding down. The hero is exhausted. You know, we don't know what's going to happen. And then if you're in The Hobbit, the eagles come in. If you're in the end of Lord of the Rings, you know, he finally flings that dang ring into the mountain, and, you know, the guys who are fighting in the battlefields can have some relief because it's going to shatter all the darkness. And this is a classic way of using, you might call it, you know, a bit of a, you know, convenient thing happening, a bit of fate, etc., a bit random, but it's actually a very time-honored writing trope, especially it pulls on the idea of catharsis. And I've seen this actually made fun of in the movie Galaxy Quest, which has, you know, they have the bomb set up and, oh no, we have to like stop the self-destruct sequence, but, you know, we did, but it's still going. And then it goes down to the end, and one of them actually says, oh, that's right, it always goes down to 0 and then it turns off. And they're kind of making fun of this thing of, it's a time-honored trope to have everything happen right to the last minute, and then catharsis, boom, we are okay, you can take a breath, and we've been saved. And so that's like one of the most acceptable kind of random saves. But even with that, I think you mentioned, Heidi, you still have to have some kind of foreshadowing that the thing that's going to save them has some kind of capability.
We need to know where it comes from. I think it kind of combining with the sudden betrayal, there's a trope where a character runs off and leaves his friends in the lurch, and you think he's betrayed them. And then he comes back and bringing the help at the end. It's like, oh, he didn't betray us. He went for help. One I really remember this happening in is like a movie retelling of The Alamo, where Davy Crockett's friend does this. But of course, that ends badly. So he didn't actually succeed, but he dang tried.
Yeah, he tried, you know, but it is the Alamo. So, I mean, I was thinking there's no way that's actually going to end well.
No, it did not end well. But yeah, it's Gandalf going to bring in what does Gandalf bring? The trees in the Battle of Helm's Deep?
Yeah, that's, is it?
Aragorn breaks off.
It's Gandalf the White with the 2 hobbits, and they bring in the trees, I think, yeah.
Yeah, and then there's also in the Return of the King, Aragorn breaks off from the Riders of Rohan
and
he brings the Ghost Army. So that's a pretty. I think it happens like 3 times in Lord of the Rings. Tolkien really loved that one.
Yeah, the thing is, no one really complains about it, because having things go right down to the wire and then having some kind of savior come in or some kind of relief come in, that is a time-honored bit of writing craft there. And if you can execute it well, readers will appreciate it, they'll enjoy it, they'll like reading it. If you can't do it well, then, you know, that's a problem.
But it just seems like you cheated, you know.
Yeah, exactly. And you have something else to tell us about cheating, right, Heidi?
Yeah, I think that we talked about this a little earlier, that things that happen at random need to follow a set of rules. And my favorite example of this is a story that is basically a series of almost random occurrences, but they all follow a theme and a set of rules, and that is the original Jumanji, or even the storybook Jumanji, which my daughter loves. You have this game, and it has these rules. They're set out right at the beginning, and what happens at every play of the game is random. Sometimes it's a hunter, sometimes it's a crocodile, sometimes it's a storm or an earthquake, but they all follow the theme, and you all know when they're going to happen. So even though they are random occurrences, they follow the existing rules of this universe. And I think that if we buy things a lot more if they're like that, like if you know that it's going to be a book character coming to life, then you expect that. If you know that what's going to happen is going to be a series of attacks, like a series of challenges, then the challenges can be kind of random among themselves. You see this in a lot of like quest journeys, is like they have to face a series of challenges, puzzles, but even though they may not be predictable in what they are, they're predictable in that something's going to happen and that it's going to follow these rules that the character has to overcome it.
Yeah, and again, those rules they help define your story world more, and they actually give you more freedom to be random within those rules. Because what is a plot if not, a bunch of rules, but then you get to choose exactly the way that you express those things, and that is entirely up to you as the author. And it just having those guidelines just gives you more of a freedom to do that and still know that the reader is going to follow your story and want to read your story, which, having readership is kind of nice to keep writing stories. You want to tell people about them.
Yes.
And going on about the idea of having rules and outer forces, we're going on to our next category for destiny, fate, or not, and that is divine intervention. And I get to say this one more time, deus ex machina, which goes back to the ancient Greeks, who would sometimes, it means, I think it's like god of metal, god of man, something like that. And the idea is they would represent the hand of God on stage to get the heroes out of scrapes. And if you know like Greek mythology and everything, the gods were totally involved in mortals' lives all the time. So it makes sense that they would have a part in their dramas and their stage plays as well. The thing is, a lot of times the phrase deus ex machina is seen as negative. The idea of, oh, of course, that's convenient. Now we have no worries because, this thing just magically happened this way. And that can be true, and that can be really annoying. At the same time, if it's well done in a universe where that could be expected, again, going back to having those guidelines, those rules, then suddenly it could be satisfying, especially if there is foreshadowing to it. And so the first thing that we talk about with this is quest stories with prophecies and chosen ones that can either be positive or negative. Although Heidi and I were talking about pre-show that you often you see a lot of negative chosen ones, people who were destined for evil turning out to be good. And we dig those. That's like really cool to see. You see the anti-hero arc coming out of that in modern day storytelling. But you don't often see the chosen good guy going bad. Like we don't see that one as much for some reason, except for Anakin Skywalker.
Yeah, I like to think he maybe ruined it for the rest of us because Obi-Wan Kenobi yelled at him too loud.
Yeah,
like, you are the chosen one.
And this is one thing you can comment about out there listeners about this, but I look through a lot of different books in different genres, and the tragic arc of the good guy going bad, maybe you find it more in lit fiction, contemporary fiction, really dramatic stuff, but in speculative fiction, everything, you just don't see it that much unless for some reason we think he's a sexy bad guy. Like it just doesn't happen. Or if it does, it's this terrible tragedy. It's definitely not a feel-good thing at all. But the thing is, in those situations, even though it can be really popular, say, oh, I don't like chosen ones anymore, I don't like prophecies anymore, if they're used well, these tropes can be wonderful and can actually pull at heartstrings. Seeing someone who was chosen to do something good go bad, the fact that they had that destiny and didn't do it makes it hurt that much more.
Yeah, I think that's why you don't see that one a lot, because it's just that letdown of all that possibilities, and there's not a lot of times that even with Anakin, eventually he gets his redemption arc.
Yeah.
So I think we want to see that redemption, and yeah, it's a tricky thing to do, to play with, breaking your readers' hearts, but at the same time, not letting them feel like they've been cheated out of a real happy ending.
Mm-hmm. And prophecies and those things, they can be great, especially if you want a structure for your story. I know all the Percy Jackson books, like at least the first ones had prophecies, from the Oracle. They were very convenient as a reader to know, okay, this is their goal. They got to do this thing in this way, in this thing. And so, again, using prophecies and chosen ones and those things, if you have them make sense within your boundaries and your story world, they can be really great for framing out your story and helping readers know what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. Just don't overuse them or use them as an excuse to not have your character to develop because he doesn't need to develop because he's a chosen one, so he's perfect. Use it as a way for them to grow and to change.
Yeah, and other things can enact change besides prophecies. I think a common one we see is a cursed or blessed object, an object that has some sort of power which influences those around you, and it might even change their actions or perceptions. Some favorites of these, the TV series Warehouse 13, that premise is every episode something is introduced which changes the world around it or changes the people who interact with it, and strange things start happening, and they have to go and figure out what is causing this thing.
Yeah, but the thing is, the classic idea of the cursed object that you have to go and figure out what it is. I mean, you see that in like Indiana Jones stuff. You see that in even older stories. And that there's this kind of fascination with the idea that an object could make a completely good normal person go completely reverse for no other reason than they have the object. You don't. The foreshadowing is having the object. The way that the person's going to change isn't because you see it in their behavior. It's because you see the object getting closer and closer to them. And you definitely see that a lot in horror stuff, especially the idea of, we can't trust the characters. We can't trust what's going to happen because this object could act in very impulsive ways and ruin everything.
Yeah, and a lot of times it can be like a metaphor for greed or addiction. I mean, the One Ring has been held up as like a metaphor for addiction a few times, and that definitely does influence the way characters interact with it, to the point that they can't control it in the end, and they're kind of at the mercy of it.
And it can also even like act in the same way as, the joke of you're really the person that you are on the inside when you're under anesthesia or something. You're coming out of anesthesia, that sweeps away the outer layers and gets at the heart of you. And you can will show whether you're really a nice person or really not a nice person. Here is the ultimate source of power. How much can you really take of this, etc.
Or the mask in the mask.
yeah, exactly. Those things. So that's another thing that you can really use. Again, has kind of the same rule of divine intervention in the case of, especially at the start, it's very difficult to resist. Or if you can resist it, it takes a lot out of you. Now, going on from like kind of somebody having godlike powers to actually being, gods, you often see this with mythology, where you actually use gods. I mentioned Percy Jackson, which is, based in modern mythology. It's kind of a middle grade urban fantasy idea there. It is middle grade urban fantasy that goes to young adult urban fantasy. And that's where you often see that with the gods taken seriously in modern stories is with urban fantasy, and epic fantasy too. And that can work really well, again, if you follow your own rules. There's one trope that I've seen lately that kind of annoys me, and that's the trope of, it's a god, but it doesn't really matter. They just work at Kinko's. It's okay. And while it's fun, and I, as a huge fan of urban fantasy, I love seeing, the combination of the ordinary and the extraordinary. If you lower the godliness of the god too much, you kind of wonder, why are they even there? Why not just have it be an ordinary special person? If you're going to make someone, a god, then make them a god and make them a force in the story. It can be a great way, again, to literally have that kind of intervention, to have these crazy things happen, etc., in your stories. But, use it smartly. And if you're going to have it in there, then use it. Don't ignore it.
One place that gods often come in is in either the striking down of a bad character or the resurrection of a good character. And it's a power you really have to play with carefully, because if you have too much resurrection magic in a world, then the stakes become totally neutered after a while. Because if any character can come back to life at any time, then killing them has absolutely no impact. I think you saw this a lot with Doctor Who, like Rory. I loved Rory as a character. I'm not complaining about Rory
Team
as a
Rory!
character.
Love
Yes, he is a
Rory!
great character. But they played with I think they knew that we loved him, so they thought they could tug on our heartstrings by just killing him over and over again. But after a while, it was like, we know what's going to happen.
You started to see, yeah, I think Rory's been wearing a lot of red shirts lately, like.
Yeah. You need that possibility that this could be the last time in order for it to work. Otherwise, it just becomes kind of like, I don't care that he died because I'm probably going to see him again. I mean,
yeah, like at the old trick, are they in the credits? They're in the credits. And you do see that, I mean, in speculative TV shows in general, my husband and I lately are like, oh, he's dead. Okay, he can come back this way, this way, this way, this way. It could be a doppelganger, could be this. So you got to be careful in speculative fiction have people take things a little bit seriously.
Yeah, and a lot of shows do this. You want to have the impact of killing a character without the cost to the overall story of them not being there. And that's where it gets kind of tricky.
Yeah. You can do that well if you give the character consequences. Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. killed off Coulson and gave him like issues forever coming back. Or no, he got killed off in the first Avengers movie, then came back in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and they gave him a complex about it for like a year.
Yeah.
And then there was another one. I saw this, it was a short-lived show called The Glades, which was like, upscale urban fantasy kind of thing. And at the end, they begged this dark witch to bring their son back. And he comes back and he's like super creepy. And she's like, well, you wanted him back. You didn't say you wanted him the same.
Yeah. And I think also another way to do it is to have there be circumstances that are clear. This is a one-time thing, or it's a thing that's not going to happen often. Maybe some sort of bargain has to be struck and cost has to be paid to get them back to the UK again. We're going to do the Lord of the Rings as a good example for a lot of things because I think I love it. But Gandalf has a sacrificial death, spoilers, with the Balrog and is sent back by the Valar. And it's pretty clear that that's only going to happen to him. Boromir doesn't come back. Throughout the thing, people do die and don't come back. So it's clear that this is the one-time exception to the rule because he is a wizard or a Mayor, and he did something that was like died in an epic feat that pushed him back and stuff. So yeah, it can be done. I think you just need to make it special.
Yeah, and this also reminds me of the short-lived TV show that should have gone on longer, Pushing Daisies. The guy can bring back the dead, but he has a couple of specific rules behind it, including like he can bring them back, he has to touch them, he can bring them back, talk to them, but then if he's touched them again, they go back to being dead. If he doesn't touch them after 30 seconds or something like that, something else around him of like equivalent life force will die instead. And after that, if they come back permanently, he can't touch them again. And so the big thing of the show, and this is slight spoilers, but it's just a fantastic part of the show, he brings back his girlfriend permanently, so someone else dies, but then also he can't ever touch his girlfriend again. And those are the kind of things, even that was done for like a comedy effect, but it's still, again, it's satisfying because it has limitations on it.
Yes.
And going on to rules, we're going to have a little bit of open discussion here about this rule that has been going around the internet, Pixar story rules. It's been a meme that has like all these different story rules on there. And it says that coincidences that hurt a character are good for storytelling, but ones that help them are bad. So we're thinking agree or disagree here?
I think that it's something you have to be careful with, but I don't think it's a flat out total rule because a lot of things that do happen in life are technically coincidences. I think that they can also be used to give a character like a shot in the arm of hope too. Like the character's walking down the street and he's on his last leg and he finds $20. What does he do with it? Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, right? Mm-hmm. The character, he's had disappointments and he finds the money and he uses it to buy the ticket or buy the chocolate bar that ends up having the ticket. And other times it's like the character that it sets him up to have his adventures it's technically a coincidence and it does technically help him. And
that's works. A great example actually, because I love that part. And you just feel so bad for the guy. Again, I think, Pixar rules are guidelines, not really rules. Yes. And when breaking that quote unquote rule would help the storytelling beats, give the reader a sense of catharsis and hope and serve the story, then please just break the rule.
Yeah, and I think that the difference is Charlie's had so much bad luck that we're rooting for him to have a break. If it's a character who's just getting all the luck, then we kind of don't
Take him down
relate
a
to
peg
him
or two.
anymore. Yeah, we want him to trip up. We don't want somebody to just skate by. You want it to be hard. They have to kind of earn that luck.
No, I agree. That actually completely justifies what I'm planning on doing in a future book that I'm already getting in trouble with readership for.
I'm glad I can give you permission for that, Janeen.
Oh, he's going down. If you're a reader of my books, in my group, you might actually know I've been warning of terrible things happening to this character, but it's time for me to get pulled down like 5 pegs. Yeah. But the last thing we're going to go on to here is a couple of like guidelines Heidi went back to in terms of like, what happens in real life versus what happens in fiction.
Yeah, because real life is stranger than fiction. There are a lot of weird things that happen every day, and a lot of what governs our life does really seem to be random chance. And there's not really a lot of rhyme to it. People wander into your life, you meet them for 5 minutes or they're part of your life, and they wander out and you don't see them again. And we don't ask, well, what was their purpose in the story? What was the purpose of that random waiter you talked to for 5 minutes?
Okay, to be fair, some people do. I'm friends with people who do. And there are some people who are like, what does it mean? Where's it going? But that's not everyone. Okay, a lot of us are just like, well, you know what? Sometimes things just happen because they happen. Or, there might be, if you have a kind of faith, you might say, okay, well, everything does happen for a reason, but we're not always going to know it all the time. So don't obsess about it. There may be, there's a sovereign authority there, but you know what? You can't entirely obsess about why this thing is happening because you're not that, you're not God. Okay.
You're not going to find out why. It's like,
yeah, exactly. You're not going to find out why. You're not God. So you don't stress about it. And so we do accept a lot of things that can happen for various reasons, or at least, accept that there is some kind of plan that we won't really know about for those things. But in books, you don't get away with that. You're not going to have readers saying, well, these things are really random, but I accept that the author has a divine plan. That does not work. I know as authors, we can often feel like, we're like the gods of our worlds, but readers can be really tough on these things a lot of times, especially in this day and age. Real life doesn't have to make sense. And if you want sense, you have to accept some kind of higher power authority in place that is guiding things that you're not going to know about. As an author, the readers know that it's you. They know that it's your fault. You can't say, well, God told me to do this. Well, you could, but the thing is, they're going to say no, but you wrote the thing down. And so you have to be a lot more careful and structured what we're doing, which is, kind of a mantra we've had this entire episode, is that you do have to have rules. You have to have a plot. It has to make sense, unless you're writing very, very, very experimental fiction, which, in case Lord love you, may not sell well unless, you get picked up and, I don't know, someone endorses it. But the thing is, for the vast majority of people, you do need to have things make sense in your story. You need a problem that needs to be solved for good or evil. You need to see characters grow, or if they don't grow, it needs to be in a genre that makes sense for them not to grow. There is one area where random things can happen in story plotting almost exclusively. And what area is that, Heidi?
That's usually the inciting incidents. I think we kind of touched on this with Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I don't know if technically plot-wise that is the inciting incidents, but it is kind of what starts his particular journey.
It's true. It gets him into the Chocolate Factory.
Any story where a character finds a dragon egg or a mythical creature just randomly. And I think the reason it does work as the inciting instance is because the story hasn't begun yet and they're not the hero yet. We don't want things to randomly just go right or wrong go right for the hero, but we do kind of accept it when he's just a random person, because random things happen to random people. At least that's my take on it. It's like, well, now this is your story. Your story has started. Boom.
Yeah.
What you going to do with it?
You must suffer. You must grow. You must change. There must be these things happening. But before that, you're just like, everyday average person, etc. So readers go a little bit easier on you then. As soon as you become the protagonist, it's like all bets are off.
Because then we're watching and paying attention to what you do. And we're waiting for you to screw up.
Yeah, exactly. And if it doesn't happen the way that readers want, they know where the author lives. It may be hard to 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 get a hold of whatever deity you believe in to talk to them, but they know where authors live and they can find you. Or hopefully, I mean, that sounds kind of stalker. Hopefully not actually stalking you. We're not talking about a resurgence of that creepy Stephen King novel that I forget the name of. Was it Misery? Yeah. We're not suggesting this. We do not endorse this at all. But the point is, you do want to tell a story that readers are going to relate to and connect with in your own special way. So having those guidelines in place can just help you use the tools of fate and destiny effectively.
And I think it is kind of wish fulfillment that you are a normal person and something happens to you that sets you on an adventure. Even if that thing is you being chosen for some strange reason, like Gandalf chose to knock on Bilbo's door because he saw something in him. Mm-hmm. But other times it's like you just find this magic item and you have to choose what to do with it. Or you're just born into a family that has a fate and then you have to choose what to do with it. Once the random has happened to you, then choice kicks in. And I think choice is what makes characters interesting and by default stories compelling.
Yeah, and that's even for contemporary fiction. You could say, well, why did, if you're talking about like, real life fiction or dramatic fiction, why did this person get cancer at this time or whatever? Well, we don't know why entirely, but the point is it puts all these things into motion and people have feels and bring skeletons out of the closet and all these other things. So it still is this one random happenstance sort of that sets everything else in motion. Now, thank you for joining us this week as we try to tie down this really big abstract concept into something that you guys can use for your own fiction. Next week, we're doing a book explosion on luck, fate, prophecies, curses, and or other situations that involve destiny.
Yes. And I'm hoping we'll be able to talk about a lot of our favorite books and call out some indie authors that you will love as well.
Because we like for book explosions for you readers and writers who are also readers to find new fun things to keep you up late at night reading. Thank you so much for tuning into Indie Book Magic. Please feel free to find us on Facebook, on Twitter, leave us a review on iTunes, share our posts around with friends or people like that. And thank you for tuning in. This is Janeen Ippolito and
H.L. Burke.
Have a fantastic day, night, or whatever time it is for you.